Imagine walking into a billion-dollar boardroom, wearing a worn jacket and holding your daughter's hand, telling a room full of executives that you're the new owner, and watching them laugh in your face until you show them a signature that changes everything. What you're about to witness is a story that begins with a stranger helping someone in the rain 12 years ago. A moment of simple kindness that nobody remembered, nobody valued, and nobody thought would matter. But that single decision in a rainstorm would eventually flip an entire empire upside down and prove that the most powerful thing you can own isn't wealth or buildings or corporate shares. It's your own dignity and the refusal to let anyone make you invisible. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a man who the world trained itself not to see, and the billionaire CEO who learned too late that the person you dismiss today might be the one holding your future tomorrow. The rain came down hard that November night, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. And Marcus Thompson was 3 blocks from his apartment in Newark when he heard the sound of metal crushing against concrete, followed by the desperate hiss of water erupting into the street. He was exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from working a double shift at the warehouse, after spending the morning fixing electrical wiring in a building where nobody remembered his name. And his first instinct was to keep walking because he had a 6-year-old daughter waiting at his mother's house, and he'd promised to pick her up before 9. But something made him turn toward the sound, some instinct older than self-preservation. And when he reached the corner, he saw a silver Mercedes wrapped around a fire hydrant with a young woman trapped inside, her hands pressed against her face, her whole body shaking. The door was jammed, and he had to pull hard to get it open, metal scraping against metal. And when she stumbled out onto the wet pavement, she was crying so hard she could barely speak, apologizing over and over, though she hadn't done anything to him. And Marcus noticed everything about her in that moment. The designer coat that probably cost more than his monthly rent. The panic in her eyes that money couldn't fix. The way she flinched when he touched her elbow to steady her. Not from fear of him, but from the shock of needing help from someone she would normally never notice. He gave her his phone to call someone and waited with her in the rain for 40 minutes until the tow truck arrived. And when she tried to press money into his hands, more cash than he'd see in 2 weeks of work, he shook his head and said something he'd been practicing since Maya was born. Something about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to grow up believing existed in the world. The woman looked at him with confused gratitude, climbed into the tow truck, and disappeared into the night, and Marcus walked home in soaked clothes, thinking about hot coffee and whether his mother had remembered to help Maya with her math homework, never imagining that he'd just met Cassandra Vale, granddaughter of Arthur Vale, the man who owned half the buildings Marcus had ever worked in, never imagining that 12 years later that moment would change everything. Cassandra Vale forgot about that night almost as soon as it ended, or rather she remembered it the way people remember embarrassing mistakes, as something to be filed away and never examined too closely. And by the time she became CEO of Vale Industries at 29, she'd trained herself to think of the world in terms of quarterly earnings and market share, numbers that were clean and predictable, unlike the messy reality of people who needed help on rainy streets. She was brilliant at what she did. Everyone said so. The youngest CEO in the company's history, and she'd earned it too, working 18-hour days and making decisions that older executives were too cautious to make, cutting costs and maximizing efficiency, and proving that a woman with the Vale name could be just as ruthless as her grandfather had been when he built the empire from nothing. But there was something missing in her, something her grandfather noticed in the last year of his life, when the cancer diagnosis gave him the clarity that comes from knowing your time is measured in months, not decades. And he started paying attention to the way Cassandra talked about people, like they were line items on a spreadsheet. The way she approved layoffs in certain zip codes without ever visiting those neighborhoods. The way she'd built a fortress of competence around herself that kept out anything resembling doubt or empathy, or the recognition that privilege had given her a head start she'd never acknowledged. Arthur Vale hired a private investigator, not to spy on his granddaughter, but to find the man from that rainy night 12 years ago, the stranger whose name Cassandra had never asked. And when the report came back with details about Marcus Thompson, single father, freelance electrician, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Orange, working 3 jobs to support his daughter, Arthur did something his family would never understand. He arranged a secret meeting. They sat in a diner on a Tuesday afternoon, Arthur posing as a potential client with a complicated electrical problem, and he watched Marcus work through the technical challenge with a methodical intelligence that reminded Arthur of himself 50 years ago, before the money and power had calcified into assumptions about who deserved what. And when Arthur asked a strange question, what would you do if you had more resources than you could ever use? Marcus had looked at him with those steady eyes and said without hesitation that he'd make sure he still came home for dinner with his daughter. That wealth was worthless if it cost you the things that actually mattered. And Arthur knew in that moment that he'd found what he was looking for, not a saint or a revolutionary, but simply a man who'd kept his humanity intact despite every reason the world gave him to become bitter. Arthur went home and changed his will, spending 11 months with the best lawyers money could buy to create a document so airtight that no challenge could succeed, transferring 51% of Vail Industries to Marcus Thompson, with provisions that would force Cassandra to either adapt or walk away, and he died on a Thursday in March, 12 years to the day after his granddaughter crashed her car in Newark, never knowing if his final gamble would save her or destroy her. Marcus learned about the inheritance 3 weeks after Arthur's death. Sitting in a law office so expensive the magazines in the waiting room had subscription cards made of heavy cardstock, and his first reaction was that someone had made a terrible mistake, because men like him didn't inherit billion-dollar companies. They fixed the wiring in those companies' buildings and got paid by the hour and went home. But the lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who looked like she'd never made a mistake in her life, showed him the documents and the signature and the letter Arthur had written explaining everything. And Marcus read it 3 times before he believed it was real. The letter talked about character and dignity and the difference between earning wealth and inheriting it, about how Arthur had watched his granddaughter become someone he didn't fully recognize, brilliant but cold, successful but disconnected from the human cost of her success. And he hoped that Marcus would show her what she'd forgotten, not through speeches or confrontation, but simply by being who he was, a man who'd stopped to help a stranger in the rain because his daughter was watching even when she wasn't there. Marcus spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what to do, lying awake at night while Maya slept in the next room, thinking about the responsibility Arthur had handed him, the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in boardrooms, the communities that Vail Industries had either supported or abandoned depending on the calculation of return on investment. And he realized he couldn't walk away from this even if he wanted to, that accepting Arthur's gift meant accepting the obligation to do something with it, to prove that a different kind of leadership was possible. He told Maya the truth, sitting at their kitchen table over bowls of cereal, explaining in terms an 11-year-old could understand that her father had been given a chance to change things for people like them, people who worked hard and played by the rules, but still struggled to get ahead. And Maya had looked at him with absolute faith and asked if this meant they could get a new couch, because the current one had a spring that poked you in the back, and Marcus laughed until tears ran down his face because even in the middle of something this enormous, his daughter could remind him what actually mattered. The day he walked into Vail Industries headquarters, he wore his best jacket, the one with the small tear in the lining that he'd never had time to fix, and he held Maya's hand as they crossed the marble lobby, where a security guard took one look at them and made the instant calculation that they didn't belong. And Marcus felt the familiar weight of being judged, that exhausting burden of having to prove his right to exist in spaces that were never designed for him. But this time was different because he had documents in his jacket pocket that would flip the entire building upside down. The guard started to tell him to leave before Marcus even reached the desk, his hand moving toward his radio with practiced efficiency. And Marcus was about to explain when the elevator doors opened and Cassandra Vail stepped out, older than the young woman he'd helped in the rain, but unmistakably the same person, her designer heels clicking against the floor with the confidence of someone who'd never had to wonder if she belonged anywhere. And she glanced at the commotion with the irritation of someone whose time was too valuable to waste on whatever scene was unfolding by the security desk. When Marcus said he was there for the emergency board meeting about ownership restructuring, Cassandra actually laughed. The kind of laugh that wasn't quite cruel, but wasn't kind either. The laugh of someone so certain of their world that they couldn't imagine it changing. And she asked with barely concealed amusement, what exactly someone like him would know about Vail Industries, and Marcus could have been angry, could have enjoyed the moment of revelation that was coming, but instead he just felt tired because this was the same story he'd lived his entire life, the same assumptions wrapped in different clothes, and he wondered if Cassandra would remember the rain. He handed her the document and watched her face change as she recognized the signature, watched the color drain from her cheeks, as she understood that the mysterious investor who'd saved her company 3 years ago, the one she'd been grateful to and curious about and slightly in awe of, was standing in front of her in a worn jacket with a child holding his hand. And the laughter died in her throat as she realized she'd just mocked the man who now controlled her life's work. The boardroom was cathedral-like in its luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, leather chairs that probably cost more than Marcus's car, and 12 board members who looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed disdain. And Maya sat beside him quietly coloring in a notebook he'd brought, while grown men in expensive suits exchanged glances that said everything they thought about his presence. But Marcus had learned patience from years of being underestimated, had learned that the people who dismissed you most quickly were often the ones who'd be most shocked when you proved them wrong. Gerald Morrison, the CFO whose family had been in finance for 4 generations, called the situation absurd and demanded that Cassandra stop wasting their time, and others nodded agreement. But then Patricia Chen entered with her briefcase and made phone calls that verified every document, every signature, every legal provision that Arthur Vail had spent nearly a year constructing. And when she announced that it was all legitimate, the room fell into a silence so complete you could hear the city humming far below. And suddenly everyone was looking at Marcus with different eyes, calculating eyes, eyes that were trying to reassess everything they thought they knew. Marcus told them his story not to brag or to shame them, but because they needed to understand where he was coming from. And he talked about working as a janitor in this very building 5 years ago, invisible to the executives who stayed late, overhearing conversations and seeing documents left carelessly on desks, watching patterns in the business that nobody else noticed because they assumed the janitor wasn't paying attention, wasn't capable of understanding, wasn't really a person whose observations mattered. And several board members shifted uncomfortably as they realized the security implications of what he was describing, realized how many secrets they'd spilled in front of someone they'd considered beneath notice. He explained how he'd saved $12,000 from 3 jobs, how he'd taught himself about debt markets and corporate finance using library computers after his daughter went to sleep, how he'd seen Vail Industries struggling 3 years ago and recognized that the problem wasn't the business model, but the debt structure, and how he'd bought that distressed debt for pennies on the dollar, used leverage and holding companies and every financial instrument available to small investors to accumulate more and more until he owned enough to matter, and then offered the company a lifeline in exchange for equity, lots of equity. Equity that desperate executives had agreed to without looking too closely at the terms, because they were just grateful someone was willing to help. Cassandra listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, horror, admiration, and something that might have been shame, remembering those desperate days when she'd signed documents without her usual scrutiny, remembering being saved by an investor whose identity she'd never questioned, because she'd been too relieved to ask hard questions. And now that investor was sitting at her conference table, explaining how he'd outsmarted everyone in the room while working 3 jobs and raising a daughter alone and living on ramen noodles 4 nights a week. Then Richard Vail, Arthur's son and Cassandra's father, who still served on the board, did something unexpected. He started clapping slowly and deliberately. And when everyone turned to look at him, he was smiling with what appeared to be genuine respect. And he stood and walked around the table to shake Marcus's hand, telling him it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, that Marcus had done exactly what Richard had done 50 years ago, seen an opportunity nobody else could see, and had the courage to take it. And for a moment, the tension in the room shifted as the old man's approval gave others permission to reconsider their assumptions. But then Richard asked the question that mattered. Why reveal himself now when he could have continued operating from the shadows? And Marcus looked at Maya before answering, looked at his daughter who represented everything he was fighting for, and he said he was tired of being invisible, tired of his daughter growing up thinking her father had to hide who he was, tired of a system that measured worth by appearance rather than character, And he had plans for Vail Industries that required him to be present, to be active, to be acknowledged as someone whose voice mattered. He laid out his vision, not as demands, but as principles. A living wage for every employee because nobody should have to work 3 jobs like he did just to survive. Talent development programs that looked beyond Ivy League degrees to find capable people at all levels of the company. Corporate giving that actually helped communities instead of just providing tax deductions. And an ethics audit of every major decision the company had made in the last decade, every contract awarded, every neighborhood invested in or abandoned, every assumption that had guided policy. And he wanted it all examined by independent reviewers who weren't afraid to tell uncomfortable truths. Several board members winced at the implied costs, both financial and reputational, but Marcus wasn't finished. And he said he wanted Cassandra to stay as CEO, wanted her experience and brilliance and institutional knowledge, but he needed her to work with him, not against him, to help build a company that proved you could be profitable without being exploitative, successful without being cruel, powerful without forgetting the people who made that power possible. And Cassandra stared at him in genuine shock because she'd expected to be fired, expected revenge for her mockery in the lobby, expected anything except partnership. The negotiation took hours, Patricia verifying details, Gerald running numbers that showed Marcus's proposals would actually improve retention and productivity, even if they cut into short-term margins. Other board members asking questions that ranged from hostile to genuinely curious. And through it all, Maya sat coloring, occasionally looking up at her father with absolute confidence that he knew what he was doing, and her presence was a reminder that this wasn't about ego or revenge, but about building something better for the next generation. By sunset, they'd reached a tentative agreement. Marcus would assume ownership. Cassandra would remain as CEO with expanded authority to implement changes. The board would be restructured to include representatives from different levels of the company, not just executives and major investors. And a comprehensive transformation plan would be developed to turn Vail Industries into a model for ethical business practices. And as board members filed out, some were already planning their exits, while others were intrigued by the challenge of proving this could actually work. Cassandra stayed after everyone left, standing at the window looking out at the city, and without turning around, she said quietly that she'd judged him, had seen his clothes and his situation and assumed he was nobody, had been completely wrong, and Marcus came to stand beside her with Maya between them, and he said gently that the problem wasn't her initial skepticism, which was reasonable, but her certainty, her absolute conviction that he couldn't be who he claimed because of how he looked, and that certainty had blinded her to possibility, had made her miss what was right in front of her. And he understood because the whole system was designed to make people like her certain and people like him invisible. She asked how he didn't hate her, and Marcus said simply that hate took energy he needed for building something better, that she wasn't a bad person, just someone who'd forgotten to see people, which was easy when you spent your whole life in towers, looking down at numbers instead of names. And Cassandra felt something crack inside her, some defense she'd built over years of corporate warfare. And she said she wanted to learn, wanted to see what he saw, wanted to be better than she'd been. And Marcus shook her hand, a real handshake between equals, and said, "Then let's get to work." And Maya cheered because even at 11, she understood that something important had just happened. The months that followed were brutal. Implementing Marcus's vision meant fighting entrenched interests, convincing skeptical investors that short-term costs would lead to long-term gains. Navigating media scrutiny when the story leaked and reporters descended, wanting to write either inspiration porn, but the janitor who became an owner, or hit pieces about unqualified leadership, neither narrative capturing the complex reality of what was actually happening. And there were moments when Marcus lay awake, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he should have just taken his windfall and disappeared into comfortable obscurity. But then he'd talk to employees whose lives were changing, single mothers who could finally afford childcare, janitors taking business classes through the new education program, communities receiving investments they'd been denied for decades. And he'd remember why this mattered. Cassandra transformed slowly, not through some dramatic revelation, but through accumulated experiences that chipped away at her certainty. And she started leaving the office to visit job sites and talk to workers whose names she learned. started understanding that the numbers she'd relied on were shaped by assumptions she'd never questioned, started recognizing that real power wasn't about domination, but about elevation, about lifting people up rather than climbing over them. And she discovered something surprising, that building a company that cared about its people didn't mean sacrificing success. Productivity actually increased when employees felt valued. Innovation flourished when diverse voices were heard. Retention solved problems that had plagued them for years. And the transformation was hard, but it was working. 1 year after Marcus walked into that lobby, Vail Industries was featured in business magazines again, not for Cassandra's ruthlessness, but for being named one of the most ethical companies in America, for proving that paying living wages increased profits, because employees who weren't exhausted from working multiple jobs were more productive, that investing in communities created loyal customers and stable markets, that treating people with dignity was actually good business. And skeptics who'd predicted disaster were forced to admit the experiment was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. Marcus stood in the same lobby where he'd been dismissed, watching new employees arrive for orientation, and the security guard from that first day approached nervously. David was his name, and he'd been promoted to supervisor of a new training program that gave people second chances, and he apologized again for that day. Said he'd been wrong about so many things, but Marcus shook his head and said David had been doing his job based on what he'd been taught to value, and now he was teaching people to value different things. And that's what mattered. Not past mistakes, but present choices. Maya ran across the lobby, 12 now, and more confident, having just toured the new childcare center the company had built, and she grabbed her father's hand and asked if she could work here when she grew up. And Marcus knelt down and told her she could work anywhere she wanted, do anything she dreamed, because that was the whole point, to make sure everyone's children had choices and opportunities and chances, not just the children of executives, but all children. And Maya hugged him tight, while Cassandra watched from near the elevators with a genuine smile that was so different from the condescending laugh of a year ago. They walked together to the auditorium where 50 new employees waited, people from every background and neighborhood, people who would start their careers with living wages and real benefits and genuine opportunities to advance, people whose lives would be different because one man had refused to accept that circumstances defined possibilities. And as Marcus stepped to the podium, he looked out at faces that reflected the real world beyond boardrooms, faces filled with hope and hunger and determination. And he remembered standing in the cold a year ago, holding his daughter's hand and promising her everything would change. Remembered the security guard's contempt and Cassandra's laughter and the board member's dismissal. Remembered all of it and felt grateful for every obstacle because they'd taught him that being underestimated was an advantage if you were willing to work, while others doubted. He welcomed them without pretense, told them they were there because they'd earned it through potential, not pedigree, told them some of them were working multiple jobs right now, raising children alone, told they don't belong in places like this. And he wanted them to know he'd been there, had worked as a janitor in this building, had lived on ramen and worried about rent and been dismissed by people who never bothered to see him. And now he owned the company. Not because he was special, but because he'd never accepted that his starting point determined his destination, because he'd refused to let other people's limitations become his own. And the room erupted in applause that started slow, then built like thunder. And Cassandra was clapping too, with tears in her eyes, transformed by witnessing proof that change was possible, that the business world could be different if people had the courage to make it so. Marcus stepped back and let Cassandra handle the practical details, while he picked up Maya, who wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered that he did good. And he whispered back that they did good together, that none of this would matter if he couldn't come home to her every night, if he lost himself in the power and forgot what he was fighting for. And in that moment, standing in a room full of people whose lives would be better because he'd claimed what he'd earned, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since his wife died, and left him alone with a toddler and impossible dreams. He felt complete, purposeful, like every sacrifice and struggle had mattered, had changed the world in ways that would ripple forward through generations. And somewhere out there, another person was deciding whether to give up or keep fighting, and he hoped his story would reach them, would remind them that the distance between the lobby and the boardroom isn't measured in floors, but in courage. The circumstances are temporary, but determination is permanent. That being dismissed and overlooked doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means the people doing the dismissing haven't learned to see yet. And sometimes the signature that changes everything is written not in boardrooms, but in rain-soaked streets where strangers help each other simply because it's right, because a daughter is watching even when she's not there, because the world we build is the world our children inherit, and we owe them better than what we were given. We owe them the courage to stand in rooms where we don't belong and declare ourselves the owner, not of companies or wealth, but of our own dignity, our own worth, our own refusal to accept that power belongs only to people who look a certain way or come from certain places. And as the sun set on that day, painting the glass tower in shades of possibility, Marcus looked out over the city and smiled, knowing that Arthur Vale's gamble had paid off, that Cassandra was becoming someone her grandfather would be proud of, that 50 new employees would go home tonight to families who depended on them and tell stories about their first day at a company that actually valued them, and that somewhere in East Orange, a 2-bedroom apartment with a purple jacket hanging by the door was waiting for him, a home built not from marble and glass, but from love and sacrifice and the determined belief that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they refused to stay invisible, if they kept working while others doubted, if they remembered that every empire was built by someone's hands, and those hands deserve to be seen, to be valued, to be given the chance to hold something more than tools, to hold the power to change not just their own lives, but the systems that told them they didn't matter. And that was the real inheritance Arthur Vale had given him. Not wealth or control, but permission to believe that a man who stopped in the rain could own the building where it fell. That kindness wasn't weakness, but the strongest foundation anything could be built on, that his daughter would grow up in a world slightly better than the one he'd inherited. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the signature that mattered most.